listening to the Deep Purple Podcast, a fan podcast devoted to one of the greatest bands in rock history, Deep Purple. Your hosts, Nate and John, cover their shared history with the band, discover new music together, and cover the farthest reaches of the Deep Purple family tree and beyond. Here's Nate and John now.
Welcome to the Deep Purple Podcast, bonus episode 22, John Lord, Before We Forget. But I am not alone on this bonus episode. I am here with someone whose name you've heard on many, many, many episodes for many, many years. One of our great friends and patrons, Mr. Ovais Naqvi.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Nate.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. My first time on.
Probably first time on. No, hopefully not. We well, I guess it depends what you say, but we've been talking for years, you and I, and had a ongoing dialogue and texts back and forth for years about just various Deep Purple related subjects. And you have done a great thing and produced an incredible book about one of your heroes, Mr. John Lord. And we're very excited to finally be able to talk about it on the show. And yeah, why don't you just, I don't know, maybe start at the beginning. What's your background with Deep Purple and why the interest in starting this project on the John Lord book?
Yeah. I guess, it's interesting because, you've got Purple's following in the 70s. And I guess people who knew the band around the in-rock Fireball period are now probably at the older kind of age demographic. But there's a huge bulge of people who got to know the band in the 80s, Perfect Strangers period. Whenever you see things online, there's a lot of reference to people seeing that tour and buying that album. And, many of us, me growing up in London, grew up listening to Whitesnake, Rainbow, from listening to chart music. I kind of gravitated to heavy rock. And in those days, everything was quite, you were part of a tribe. I mean, you were either into, reggae and Bob Marley, or into pop, or into heavy rock, or into, any number of other genres. And it was kind of segregated in quite a way. And if you listen to other stuff, it was quite secretly. Anyway, so me and a group of my friends got into heavy rock and AC/DC, and obviously the bands of that period, Iron Maiden and Tigers of Pandang, and Saxon and those kind of guys. And I got interested in Whitesnake and went to see them, a fair bit at Hammersmith Odeon at that period, and got fascinated by the guy behind the keyboard. Number one, amazing stage presence. Number two, brought a really interesting dimension and color to everything he did generally, but particularly to Whitesnake. And thirdly, bands of that period didn't have that kind of keyboard sound. Prog bands did, but the heavier rock bands didn't. So he was almost on his own as a Hammond player and a keyboard player in the heavy rock genre. I'm talking pre-synthesizer, pre-Def Leppard and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but when they actually allowed them on stage.
Where they actually, you weren't behind the curtain. You weren't actually allowed to be on stage. So, he was one of the few, mid-stage guys, stage right or whatever, and very prominent and very, charismatic on stage. So I got interested in him as a result of that. And, like many people, heard him, wondered what his musical history was, got into Purple, got into Rainbow alongside that, got into a bit of prog, got rekindled my interest in classical listening to him. So, he became almost like a kind of a channel for so many different explorations I had around music. And then his own solo album, Before I Forget, came out at the same time, roughly that period. So I got fascinated by him, and he had an aura, and he had a charisma, and he had a mystique I think a lot of people don't have, certainly from an audience perspective. As a band member, he was one of the guys, but certainly for audiences, he had some kind of additional feature about him that put him on a slightly different pedestal. So I stayed fascinated by him, and was less interested in Purple in the 90s, like many, I guess, around the, Battle Rages On period. There was a bit of a lull, and then Steve joins, and then, many of us come back in the 2000s, certainly around the Now What period. But I stayed interested in him and in, the great Purple material of the 70s and even 80s. And then as a result of that, I had a period in my life where I was in the publishing industry, was lucky enough to work with a few kind of luminaries in the sports world. But I figured about 2 or 3 years ago, there was nothing authoritative on John Lord. There was nothing with, strong research, insight, which wasn't already published. When you get material that you look at around Purple and Whitesnake, no disrespect, but it's usually stuff that's already been in the media, been in Kerrang, been in Sounds, been in Keyboard Magazine, whatever it is. So I figured there was a way of, number one, assimilating all of that into a definitive story about John Lord, his sound, his keyboards, his approach to music, classical rock, and what made him tick as a instrumentalist. And then on top of that, no one had really kind of done too much original stuff, his musical pedigree, growing up in Leicester, talking to his family members. He was obviously very private, and that meant that there was a little bit of a wall around getting to know him, beyond his public persona. So I tried carefully, but figured, there's a way to get into a little bit of that carefully, speaking to the right people, building trust, getting to know Paul Mann, Colin Hart, Willie Fife, Ozzy Hop, and then eventually Stephen Lord, his brother. So I got a lot of color around personality to a degree, but an enormous amount around his musical approach, his compositional style, and really the way he put things together. So, it became very much a labor of love to try and understand how we, in a sense, use all of that information and data to really put him on almost on a new pedestal.
Yeah, and it's I believe the first time that you and I were ever in touch, you had mentioned that you'd made a contribution to this great book, which I'm pointing to, not that anybody can see it, all those years ago, which was this great photo book. But it was really more kind of recollections about John from people that knew him, like brief little takes from various people. You had contributed some photos to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, I'd got remarried at that time in the early 2010s. And as part of my wedding present, a friend of my wife's, husband and wife, he found some amazing photos from the Saraband recording session in near Dortmund, near Marl, actually, a town near Dortmund, in September of 1975. And it was extremely thoughtful of him to do that, but I was amazed that these pictures existed. And then he happened to know a musician in the orchestra, a friend of his, Manfred Storker. So I got those pictures, and I figured at that point, and I contributed them to the Rufus Stone book at that time because they hadn't been seen. I've been after him ever since if he's got any more pictures, but he seems not to have more than about 5 or 6 left. Yeah. But these pictures give you an enormous kind of sense of what's going on behind the scenes. You see a lot of the instrumentation. You see him with the orchestra. Eberhard Schöner's there. These figures who are discussed as being on the album, Paul Carrass and Pete York and Andy Summers. You see these guys in the photographs. So I figured, there's a bunch of material probably even out there that's never really been unearthed. Never mind people who've never been spoken to. So I stayed interested in the subject, over that 10-year period, and figured at some point, there's probably an original editorial, an original research dimension to it. And then I guess the tipping point for me was going onto organ forums and keyboard forums and Purple forums and seeing all this opinion about different Hammonds he played and different effects and, ring modulators and Fisher space expanders and, different types of Leslie and Hammond combinations, eventually the Marshall, the Hammond direct to the Marshall, which he started doing in 1970. So, but it was all fragmented and some of it incorrect. anecdotal incorrect, anecdotal correct, anecdotal unproven. So I figured there's got to be a way to put it all together, verify it, and then start unearthing some really interesting nuggets of information. And if you, for example, take 1968 to 2002, with a heavy amount of Hammond specialist contribution from a guy I connected to online called Con Zissis, who's based in Melbourne. We've unearthed that there were 7 different Hammonds John used from 68 to 2002. It wasn't just the one he acquired from Christine McVie in 73, which he played at California Jam in 74. And obviously the Hammond that he acquired when Purple formed in February of 68. There were an array of different Hammonds he used, all of which were, a number of which were hired from a London rental company. And with that rental company came a guy called Mike Phillips, who was responsible for maintaining John's organ and keyboards, RMI piano and stuff like that, and did an extraordinary job of creating with John this unique Hammond sound with a combination of RMI piano and effects like the ring modulator and the space expander, and then taking out the Leslie, which was preceded Mike a little bit, but he got involved around the California Jam period and afterwards. And so you get an amazing thing, which is the ability to identify all these different keyboards. But more importantly, as you listen to these different records in different live performances, they all sound like John Lord. I mean, the first thing anybody says, including Paul Mann, is, he could touch a Bontempi organ and it would sound like John Lord. It didn't matter what it was. It could be a keyboard effect on a polyphonic synth, or it could be a cheap organ, or it could be a hired-in organ that he's just tampering with to get it right. A lot of which you see on YouTube and playing on the the Gillan's Inn album, or the Armenia record with Tony Iommi and Ian. But everything sounds like John Lord the moment he touches it. So, and then you dig in and you realize there's an array of stuff, including, for example, on Perfect Strangers, the Hammond he plays there, which you see in the video that Bruce Payne shot, the home produced stuff. That's the rainbow organ that belonged to Richie Blackmore or Thames Talent or what have you. But that's like a cut down Hammond Chop B3, which is black and has a much wider body because the innards of the organ have been moved to the top level. So, and he plays that again in Come Hello High Water. So, you start digging in, it gets a bit geeky, but then you start being able to definitively identify, wow, there's this extraordinary inventory of stuff he played, most of which, sadly, is now lost. It's very hard to locate much of this stuff.
And that's when you sent the kind of final draft of the book cover, and I saw the title for the first time, Before We Forget. I was like, genius, because you are literally talking to all these retired folks that worked with the band and all that, just trying to piece together this mystery, and you've put together the most complete compendium of John's musical gear that there's ever been. And the cool thing about it is I think it would function really well as a reference work for people who are trying to figure out, well, how is he getting that sound during that time? But it's also a book. It's like something you could sit down and read. It's a coffee table book. It kind of fills multiple. It takes multiple angles on John Lord and his work and his equipment. And I remember when you first mentioned this, you said, "Oh, I'm just going to put together like a ebook or a pamphlet. It'll be probably 3,000 or 4,000 words." And how did it grow from that into being what it is?
It's really interesting, Nate, because I think you'll be familiar, obviously, on the writing and literary side. I mean, you kind of, everyone's got their own way of writing stuff. I mean, I published stuff. I've been lucky enough, as I said, to work with guys like Muhammad Ali and Pele and real luminaries in the sports world, and found them fascinating. And generally, at that point, took a view: I'm never going to do anything about anybody unless I really like them and unless I believe in their nature. To me, to work with somebody who I don't admire is meaningless. It's got to be somebody you've got an emotional belief in. and they've got a sense of purpose and they stand for something, and obviously John Lord stood for a lot of things around musical excellence and around, Hammond and so forth, as well as being an incredibly nice guy. The one thing everybody says, and I wanted to avoid doing a book about how nice he was, because it's fine, but it's not very literary, because everybody goes, he was an amazing guy. And I'll tell you a couple of stories in a minute about that, but I didn't want the book to center on that. The other thing I wanted to do was protect his privacy, because obviously he never really spoke too much about his family, his background, even his early piano tuition and stuff. We didn't really talk about it too much. He alluded to it rather than talking about it. So I figured, how do you do this? The answer is do it respectfully, respect his privacy, but really start thinking through, how the inventory of stuff he played can be recorded and identified. And then going beyond the Hammond, if you start going into, I guess, RMI piano, preceding that, the Mellotron 2 that he played in Deep Purple, Mark 1. He then gets an RMI piano in 1970, and then starts experimenting a little bit with the Mini Moog around that period. Doesn't acquire one for Purple, but on a trip to California, which I suspect is probably the Hollywood Bowl concerto performance in June of 70. The Mini Moog is starting to become a known instrument at that time, and he somewhere along the line he gets pulled in to try one out, and he's quite enamored and interested in it. And then around 73, clearly with everybody playing ARP Odysseys, ARP 2600s, Mini Moogs, and so forth, he starts realizing I can bring some of that to Purple. And around Burn, you start seeing the emergence of the ARP sound and a bit more synthesized effects, or an emphasis on them, I should say, like, A200 and tracks like that. I've got a bit more synth on them. So I figured, number one, let me catalog it all and turn it into an article. And as you rightly pointed out just now, I figured it'll be 4,000 or 5,000 words, probably too geeky to publish anywhere apart from a keyboard magazine. Maybe somebody will stick it on a website, and maybe Nate will be generous enough to post it somewhere. And then I kind of figured it needs to be readable and have, a good story attached to it. And then I realized that in the course of linking the instruments to the music, linking the instruments to the backdrop of synthesizer, the synth revolution in the 70s, if you go from, the Moog modular system into the electric keyboards like the Mellotron and the RMI piano, and then you go into the Mini Moog and the ARP, and then you get, I guess, the polyphonic era with the Polymoog and Oberheim emerging, and Prophet, and then you get the incursion of the Japanese players in a really big way, Korg, Yamaha, Roland particularly, which starts to happen in the 70s, particularly with Yamaha, with, the Yamaha GX1, the Yamaha CS80, which becomes quite a prominent keyboard even in rock in the late 70s. And then you get the Oberheim, OBX, and OBXA, which you hear on stuff like Jump, Van Halen, a lot of, subdivisions, Rush is Oberheim as well. So I figured, really, that's interesting. Okay, so you got the stuff John played, and you got the stuff he used on Purple records. And then if you dig around, there's a hell of a lot more experimentation on synths that he did than he's given credit for. And then if you frame that story against the evolution of synthesizers in the 70s and 80s, and then the emergence of MIDI and sampling first, and then MIDI, the emulator, which he starts using on Perfect Strangers, the emulator 2, and the Yamaha DX1 and DX7, which he starts using on House of Blue Light, and then, the Roland D50, and then the Yamaha CP70, CP80, CP80M, and then he moves to using Roland pianos in the 90s, and then uses the Korg M1, the workstation, and then even, a Korg module, and there's a lot of Lord stuff that goes off stage at that time. You were talking about, stuff being off stage, people being off stage, well, the bunch of his keyboards go off stage. So then you start realizing there's a Hammond history for which he's synonymous, but there's a synth history as well, which is really interesting, played out against the backdrop of the synth revolution. So then I realized that it's almost a bit contrapuntal, if you want to get a bit technical, which is there's a strand of John, and there's a strand of his musical evolution and his musical pedigree and history, and then there's Hammond and synthesizer and the evolution of the Purple Sound. In a way, I was trying to write a book about him without talking about him. I figured in a funny, weird way, how would he have done a book? The answer is he would probably have been quite shy about talking about himself all the time. He'd have certainly talked very eloquently about other people and their contribution to his story and his life, but he'd probably have been reluctant to talk about himself. So I figured that's an interesting kind of a reference point, which is, let me do a book about everything around him that tells his story, but without necessarily going directly into him. So there's almost a kind of a halo, if you like, around the John Lord story without talking about him. How do we go around him, talk about the music, the instruments, the life, the people, and almost tell the story around him in an interesting way. That's kind of
like, he's sort of the planet which all these stories are revolving around or orbiting.
Totally correct.
You're getting the sense of his gravitational effect on everything around him without being like, here's all this personal details about him.
That's totally spot on. I didn't want to get into it, and sadly, obviously, his wife Vicky passed away, a few months ago. I definitely didn't want to tread into the territory of personal life, marriage, family, whatever, because he never talked about it, and I definitely didn't want to go there. Insofar as it sounds like an idyllic existence in many ways, but I didn't want to necessarily focus on that. I figured, as you rightly pointed out, he's almost like there's all this kind of constellation of different things going on. And then you talk to people like Ozzy, who's now become obviously very successful with Wizard Promotions in Germany, which his son now runs, and Willie Fife. And you start realizing, and Paul Mann, who becomes a prominent feature in the story after a bit. And then obviously I get to know Stephen Lord, his brother. They all loved him. They all miss him. He was an incredibly important feature in their life. And their lives, in a funny way, slightly empty without him, which is a good thing. That's not a bad thing. Everybody around him thinks about him every other day, every day. Fans like us think about Purple band members every other day, and certainly about him all the time. So I became immersed in his aura, and then realized so many things gravitated, towards him and around him. He had an enormous social circle. And when you look at, the recollections of people like Mickey Moody and even Coverdale, never mind Bernie Marsden and Paul, they all say, oh, I met Michael Palin at John's house, or I met, John Hurt, or I met, Joe Brown, or I met Tony Ashton, or I met, George Harrison, particularly features quite heavily in the 80s and 90s as somebody who was clearly an important part of, they were an important part of each other's social circle. So you start realizing he had not just an incredible aura within the band, which when you talk to people like Roger Glover and Ian Pace, obviously, and Ian Gillan, he was a kind of like a brother to them, almost like a hero figure, actually, to them all, because of his behavior and his way of just making everybody feel comfortable. But then he was a social magnet as well, because when you look at Burntwood, where he lived in the 80s, and Uden Lodge, where he lived after that into the early 2000s, he had a enormous social circle. I mean, you see pictures of him at John Mortimer's funeral, and he knows all these British broadcast television film people, Kathy Lett and Jeremy Irons, and he knows all these guys, and he never bragged about it. He never did that thing of Jeremy was around my house, or I was with Richard Attenborough the other day, or whatever. He doesn't do any of that, but he's got this incredible ability to engage at every level with all manner of people. It could be road crew, who he'd be very happy to sit and have a glass of cognac with, or a cigar with, and it could be major celebrities in the music world, or it could be people in the film world. He knew all these people, but incredible ability to get on with anybody.
Yeah, I remember I think he dedicated, I can't remember what it was one of his albums or something he dedicated to John Mortimer, and I learned that they were friends, and my wife is a huge Rumpole fan, so I'd heard that he dedicated one of the books to John Lord. So I went like to her bookshelf and I found the book and I was like, oh, look at that. Like this book's been in my house for 20 years and I never realized that they were friends, because he wasn't someone that you saw as like someone who's braggy or just saying like, oh, I know all these famous people. He was just kind of, but it was like they really wanted to be around him, and he had that. Of all the things in doing this show that I've read, it's if you had to make the word cloud, it's like gentleman, and people are always saying these great kind words, and I can only think of about 2 quotes out of 100 where people said anything even negative about him. And I wouldn't say it was even like slamming him, but just some negative things. And when you read those, you're like, I think that's more about the person saying it than about John Lord. I'm not going to name who those people are, but 99% of people just say the same thing about him, that he was the kindest, gentlest, nicest, most generous people that they knew.
Yeah. I mean, I've learned as I've, gone through life, most of what you map onto other people as frustration is actually frustration with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And even a couple of those odd comments, which one hears, the odd person, you're certainly talking about a couple of cases I can think of. It's people just going, let me blame him, or let me, in a sense, pin the non-confrontation of a situation on him.
Mm-hmm.
Reality of bands are made up of all manner of personalities. If everybody in Purple was confrontational, it would have lasted 4 months. And everybody in the band was relatively genteel, diplomatic, and collegiate, it wouldn't have been very edgy.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, you have to. There has to be some give and take, and someone who's going to be, like you said, more diplomatic. If it was the Gillan and Blackmore duo, it would not have lasted, like you said, more than a few months. Whereas
absolutely,
you had people like Pace and Lord in the background, and just the glue to hold everything together and maybe diffuse some of those situations.
Totally. I mean, when you see it in a team context, in a working context, there are so many parallels that you start seeing in your working life when you look at bands.
Mm-hmm.
There's people who, there's a Paul McCartney, project manager type who's like, we haven't been in the studio for 3 months. Let's get up and do some stuff. John, you got to have 3 songs ready by Friday. There's that personality type. But if everybody's like that, it becomes very difficult. But you need one person who's a bit like that. And, more than anybody, Blackmore probably set the tone musically. Roger was instrumental in so much happening in the right way. There were so many Purple albums, from Perfect Strangers to, the Battle Rage. They wouldn't have happened without Roger. The House of Blue Light, Nick Blagona says Perfect Strangers was one of the best experiences of my career. House of Blue Light was one of the worst.
So just a few years later.
Literally 2 or 3 years later. So, and who's the glue holding all that stuff together between Perfect Strangers, House of Blue Light, and Slaves and Masters and Battle Rage is Roger, And Steve Lord was in touch with me by email a couple of days ago, just saying, he'd almost never encountered somebody as compassionate and kind as Roger,
Mm-hmm.
And coming as he does as the brother of John Lord, that's a heck of a compliment. So, all bands are made up of different types, but I think, when you look at, I think the thing I would say more than anything is when you look at his recognition of, Rick Wakeman says in the late 60s, if you're a keyboard player on stage, good luck with being heard. Because between Hendrix and Pete Townsend and Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page and then Blackmore, you'd be lucky to get a look in on stage, because the amplification around a keyboard just wasn't adequate enough to compete with the deafening volume that people like Townsend were getting to through their partnership with people like Jim Marshall, who becomes an instrumental figure in the emergence of heavy rock, because it's the Marshall amps that give Hendrix and Blackmore and people like that and Townsend the edge that they have around the volume. So John realizes in the Mark I period, if Gillan and Roger join in 69, I'm going to have to do something to compete with Richie, because I'm going to get blown away on stage with 100 and 200 watt amplifiers. I'll never be heard. And so when you start looking at the experimentation and really digging into it, which I've done in detail around the Leslie and the Marshalls and some of the technicalities around, the Hammond, how he plays the Hammond, the technique around Hammond playing, which he admits, his piano technique nearly went out of the window because of having to play a Hammond in a very unique way.
Mm-hmm.
Something had to give, and it was his piano style and technique. And what he did was create this incredible combination between drawbar setting, use of foot pedal, use of overdrive, eventually use of ring modulator, dropping the Leslie, including the Marshall, going direct to the Marshall, and then adding in effects, as I mentioned, like the Fisher K10 Space Expander, which gives you that kind of explosion sound at the end of some solos. You hear it on California Jam when he smacks the Hammond on top. Yeah. You get this thing. It's like these kind of effects. The tank on the Fisher gives you that noise. So you get all of these things which he's trying, he's trying to find a way to cut through. And obviously guys like Wakeman and Tony Banks and Emerson get a lot of credit for keyboard innovation. But if you take the narrowness of what he's playing with, which is the Hammond, and you go, how do I innovate just in that very narrow spectrum without, having 28 keyboards on stage? If I take Hammond, and how do I use that as a weapon to compete with the guitar? He's as innovative in that as anybody is in anything else. I find what he did with the Hammond as innovative as Keith Emerson with the Moog Constellation or the Yamaha GX1, or, and the really interesting thing that then emerges when you look at these guys, Emerson gets a lot of credit, quite rightly, brilliant player, brilliant figure, Rick, ditto, Tony Banks, ditto. But the really interesting reference points, I think, for John Lord, which I realized when you listen to the Hohner Clavinet D6 and you listen to the Fender Rhodes 73 that he plays a lot after 73 onwards. If you look at the Hohner and the Fender and the Mini Moog and even the ring modulator, he's coming from Chick Corea, Tony Williams, Herbie Hancock, Joe Zawinul. You can start hearing that he's not actually going, what's Keith playing and let me copy Keith.
Mm-hmm.
He's actually going, what's happening in jazz rock, what's happening in funk. And then Stevie Wonder is a major influence clearly on his Hohner sound, the Hohner Clavinet. Clearly taken a bunch of that from listening to Stevie Wonder records and going, that's really interesting. So, and he never talked about it too much because, again, I guess interviewers didn't explore it that much or just didn't focus on the black music element. But when you listen to Stormbringer and Hold On, and you listen to Come Taste the Band, there's not just a heavy American aspect to it, there's a heavy black element to it, which he's in his element with. If you listen to, Coverdale and Hughes get the credit, but Ian Pace and John Lord are totally in the groove on that stuff because they're as good at playing that stuff as they are at playing heavy rock. So again, they don't get full credit because you listen to Pace, Ashton, Lord. If you listen to
that's right.
Come Taste the Band, Pace, Ashton, Lord, it's heavily R&B influenced, and that's John and Ian.
Wow. Yeah. I think, not John Lord alone, but he's obviously a huge part of it. But I think a lot of people take it for granted what these early guys did, because I feel like nowadays, today, everything's so plug and play. You can buy any sort of pedal or effect that you want or a specific amp to achieve a specific sound. But when you look at, like when we were going through some of these photos and you'd send me a photo and say, Nate, can you enhance this photo a little? Like, what the hell is this? And we would go back and forth for days saying, what the hell is this? And try to match it up. And I said, I think it's this kind of piano, but this doesn't match up. And what we eventually learned on a lot of these items were they're just custom jobs. Like they had took the shell of a Fender Rhodes and most of the insides, but cut out a big section and put in something. You probably know. I don't know. But put in all of these different intermediary devices between to tweak the sound, get different sounds. And that was really illuminating for me, as this was still a very pioneering and experimental era. It wasn't as simple as just, I'm getting this piece of equipment or this instrument and I'm going to have this sound. It was, I'm getting this and I'm going to cut it open and rewire it and do whatever to achieve something that's never been achieved before.
Totally. I mean, when you look at, for example, obviously today you can pretty much get, a keyboard to sample or create anything. So you've got an extraordinary array of sounds available, as started to happen in the late 80s. I mean, even the Yamaha DX1, DX7, and particularly the Korg workstation is a revolution in music because it takes music from the stage into the bedroom. You didn't need to go to a studio anymore to create sound or to create music if you had a Korg M1. The reason is very simple. You could go end to end on the creation of a piece of music literally in your bedroom. So music moves from studio and stage into domestic environment. But if you go way back into, the RMI piano with the Fender Rhodes, even people like John started seeing limitations. And what he was trying to do, when you look at his stage setup, around 73, he'd have, the Hammond in front of him, the Hammond C3. And then above it, he'd have a ring modulator, generally just that. And then by 74, he's got the Hammond and he's got the Hohner clavinet D6. And he's got the ARP behind him. And obviously, in terms of stretch, he's clearly trying. You see a lot of that footage where he's doing all of that stuff, where he's playing, the RMI and the Hammond simultaneously. And so Mike Phillips, who worked with him, who's still alive and lives in Toronto, and I was in touch with Mike a fair bit. What he wanted to do was to trigger, the RMI through the Hammond. And so the adapt that Mike did pre-MIDI, unbelievable, was to go, how do I get John to be able to play the RMI, for example, on the lower console through the Hammond, so he can actually play both the organ and the RMI at the same time. And he managed to integrate the innards of the RMI into the Hammond. Extraordinary. And a lot of these guys went to the manufacturers. Keith Emerson was known to go back to Moog and say, can you do this for me? And they couldn't do it. I mean, they couldn't, no disrespect to Yamaha, they couldn't MIDI the GX1 the way Keith wanted to. So he had to use a guy called Nick Phillips to do all that adapt around effectively integrating MIDI with the GX1. And John did the same thing with Mike Phillips to use, the RMI with the Hammond and then to adapt the Fender Rhodes. So that the fascia of the Fender Rhodes 73 is completely different. And where I had to lean on your expertise was I saw this keyboard in the Sarabande session and I just couldn't recognize it. And it landed up through your detective work with enhancing the image. It was a Fender Rhodes 73 with a completely different fascia, which clearly was the Fender Rhodes integrated into the Hammond in the way that he'd done with the RMI. So, there's a lot going on in the background, which again is partly documented, but not fully documented. So by talking to Mike and a few other people, you start getting a picture of the amount of innovation that was going on, even with John Lord, even behind the scenes around 73, 74.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think you'd mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that integrating the RMI with the organ was what he used in Rat Bat Blue, right?
There's, when we obviously did a bit of work listening to some of that stuff, and you can definitely hear it. I mean, I would say between the ring modulator, the RMI, and the Hammond, and the overdrive that comes from that, plus the technique, you start hearing stuff that I have to admit you still can't say with 100% certainty. Because sadly, the only person who's still alive who can actually tell you definitively is, Mike can to a degree in terms of his recollection. Roger has pretty good recollection of a lot of these things because he was, I guess, in the control room a number of times. And if anybody was there when John was overdubbing his solos, it was probably Roger, as well as Martin Birch, who again is sadly no longer around. And Nick Blagone is no longer around. In fact, sadly, Derek Lawrence, Martin Birch, and Nick Blagone all died the same year in 2020.
Oh, wow. Yeah, wow.
A sad coincidence. So, you've got very few people left who can say, well, that's exactly how John did that. But, you're moving on to another interesting subject, which is when you go into YouTube channels and you see all these amazing players like, Nick Foley, and a guy called George Barabas, and, players in Poland and, in France, and an amazing Italian guy as well. You get all these guys who, through different means, achieve the John Lord sound in a way.
Hmm.
Some of them are more accurate than others, but I can think of 5 or 6 who are incredibly good at recreating the John Lord sound.
Yep.
And they do it in a variety of different ways. Some of it, just using the Hammond, some of it using, a synthesizer to recreate the Hammond sound, like a Nord. You can get a Nord to do quite a lot of stuff. And then when you look at Hammond itself, the SK1, SK2, SKX now, you see Mike McDonald on Stephen Colbert a few months ago, and he's
Oh,
playing,
yeah.
he's playing a Yamaha montage in a digital Hammond, and a guy like him is finally going, I can't heave this thing on stage around the world. I'm going to have to play the digital version. So that Hammond digital keyboards have now become a level where even a guy like Mike McDonald has no embarrassment using it because of the quality. So I'm saying, there's an incredible backstory of technical expertise, and a lot of it is unknown, kind of unheralded, or heroes who are not famous, like Mike Phillips and Nick Rose with ELP.
I have one of these plugins for my digital audio workstation here. That's I think it's called Hammond B3X or something like that.
Right.
Incredible. It sounds great. Like, yeah, you can't get all of that character like you talked about, like shaking the thing around and hearing those springs rattle and all that. But going through the presets that it comes with, and you can pull the draw bars and do all your own stuff. But most people using that, myself included, are not going to be knowledgeable enough to know what the hell we're doing. So you go to these presets, and I can think of probably 8 or 9 of them that are clearly John Lord. Like one of them I think is called Bloodsucker, and one of them is called Burn. Like they're actually, and some of them might be a little more clever than that, not just using actual songs, but they're actively going for those sounds. So he has this huge influence on that that little piece of software, because they know that people that are getting a Hammond are going to want to achieve some of his sounds, and does a pretty damn good job for what it is for my purposes. If you gave me all of John Lord's equipment and the rest of my time on this earth, I couldn't achieve anything that sounds nearly as good, because I just don't have the technical expertise.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole industry, and I dedicate a chapter to it at the end, because I didn't want to end with his passing away. It would have been a sad ending, but I figured let's actually talk about his legacy. And there's an enormous legacy in terms of the work Paul Mann does to keep the concerto alive, with people like Bruce Dickinson and even Roger and many other players. And then the other legacy, as you rightly point out, is all of this industry that's built up around recreating authentic Hammond sounds, most of which are centered around the John Lord sound, with the effects, and so many, Lounsbury effects pedals, for example, never mind the keyboard. So there's a whole industry of effects pedals, never mind a whole industry of modules and plugins and keyboards themselves, as well as the evolution of the digital Hammond. So you've got 4 or 5 different ways in which the John Lord sound is being recreated. You've got the Hammond players who still play a Hammond, like Nick Foley and some of these guys on YouTube. They still play a Hammond, and what they try and do is recreate the Lord sound with a C3 or a B3, which is, broadly speaking, the same organ, just slightly different in a cosmetic way. And then you get people who play the synth to sound like him, and then people who use effects, with a traditional Hammond. And then, as I said, as you rightly pointed out, all the plugins and modules and so on. And there's a whole industry. There's a whole industry of which you might call the John Lord sound, which is an extraordinary tribute to his definitive contribution to music. One of the biggest tributes was, I think about a year ago, Elton John wrote a piece in The Guardian around the passing of Zoot Money and of the R&B scene in London in the 60s, and he talks about keyboard players, and he mentions John Lord in that. So you got guys like Elton John, who understand entirely that Lord was a pioneering player. Guys like Benmont Tench and Elton John and so forth, they all realize that there's a sound that he got. And Don Airey talks about it often, that, you can do what you want, but you can't quite sound like John.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the classic example of the midlife crisis. Guy's pretty well off, lawyer, whatever, and buys all the gear that Eddie Van Halen has, and thinks he's going to sound like Eddie Van Halen, but he's not. He's not going to. Not only for the obvious technical musicianship reasons, but there's so much more to it than just the gear.
Absolutely. I was watching a YouTube thing the other day where somebody said exactly that. There was some, very ordinary guitar lying in a studio somewhere, and he was talking, I think, about Eddie Van Halen and Alan Holdsworth.
Mm-hmm.
He said, Alan was grumbling about the amp and about setting it up, but as soon as he touched it, he sounded like Alan Holdsworth, so it didn't really matter.
Right. A friend of mine that I grew up and played in bands with is a very, very talented guitar player, and still plays. He's great. I remember when we were kids, 15, 16 or whatever, he's playing his guitar and he's doing all these, guitar acrobatics and all that. And then he picked up my buddy's guitar, which is this cheap $99, who knows what brand it was. And he's playing it. And I'm like, wow, this sounds great. And then after about 2 or 3 minutes, he goes, oh, what a piece of shit. And then he just keeps playing. He was frustrated with the guitar because it just didn't, it was a piece of junk, but it sure sounded good when he was playing it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and then you look at people like Blackmore, and that fabulous YouTube clip that you and I have talked about of him playing with Pat Boone.
Yes, yes.
That jazzy Carlos Santana style Smoke on the Water. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
Yep.
He's Richie Blackmore, and then the light goes on, and he sounds exactly like Carlos Santana.
Yeah.
Decides to do it funky. It's unbelievable because just the verse, and that comes from, I think, session pedigree. The other thing to be noted, I think, with John Lord and with Richie was, I think, having been around in the 60s, their adaptability was incredible. I mean, Blackmore can play anything in any style, and John Lord could play anything in any style.
Mm-hmm.
He could sound like Stevie Wonder, or he could sound like Keith Emerson. I mean, he could sound whichever way he wanted. But more importantly, he sounded like himself. But the interesting thing was that versatility, in my opinion, comes from session playing. Elton John's got it as well. Keith Emerson had it as well. Rick Wakeman's got it as well. When you've been a session player, and you play with David Bowie, in the case of Rick, you don't know what's going to happen. You got to basically, as soon as the light goes on, you've got to be basically playing exactly the way he wants. And that takes an enormous amount of skill.
Yeah, I think it's just evolution, survival of the fittest.
Right.
With these session guys, time is money, obviously, but tape was also extremely expensive. So when you started to get a guy like a Blackmore or a Lord who can come down and reliably nail something and listen to something and then nail it in 1, maybe 2 takes, that guy's going to get the next job and the next job, and everyone else is going to fall by the wayside.
Absolutely. People like Page made their career in the 60s, with a session career, and so many other, unsung heroes of the session industry in the US in the 60s. I mean, reasonably well-known figures, but guys like Hal Blaine in the US, and obviously in the UK, you get so many session players, unique ability just to basically instantly fit. Glenn Campbell was an amazing session player, obviously, before he became famous. So, you hear that in his playing. I mean, you hear him playing Galveston, the guitar solo is as good a guitar solo as any rock hero guitarist, and he's Glenn Campbell, but he can play a lead line and a solo as good as any 70s rock player, because he's just got the chops.
And you do hear a lot of that with the friends projects that they worked on. For example, John Lord on Wizards Convention comes in and does a piano solo, and it's this incredible jazz style solo with jazz style backing. And you don't really hear a lot of that in his other work. You get used to this kind of style that he's cultivated with Deep Purple and a bit with Whitesnake. And then you're reminded of it when you hear all of his, not just with him, but with the others too, just guesting on their friends' work and doing whatever is going to fit that particular session or that song or that album and doing it effortlessly. And you wouldn't even necessarily recognize it as them. But then when you hear it, you say, of course, that's their style.
Yeah. I mean, I think with him, one of the common features across all of his playing is just the sheer level of expression. And the solo you're talking about with the piano part on "She's a Woman," Eddie Hardin, is a fabulous piece of jazz piano playing. And then he's on so many other records, Gilmore and George Harrison and Alvin Lee, mainly with friends as opposed to being a session player. Obviously, Bernie Marsden and people like that. But, you know, in a way, I think because he was so busy with Purple and Whitesnake, he probably didn't get enough of a chance, you know, to do as much of that as he might have wanted to because he was just so busy. I mean, somebody asked me the other day, you know, how come from Before I Forget in 1982, you know, he didn't do another solo album apart from the Country Diary of an Edwardian Lady soundtrack that he did in 84, which is a great piece of work.
Oh, yeah. You sent me that a while back.
Yeah, but he didn't do a solo album until Pictured Within, you know, in 98, which is a massive 16-year gap. And I think the answer is very simple. I mean, I think it was just touring all the time with Whitesnake and Purple. There were clearly moments of frustration in periods of those bands' histories. I mean, he always talked about how he found being in Whitesnake quite limiting and quite frustrating because he was just a backing musician in his own opinion. And for me as a fan, and I'm sure for you and other people, you know, some of the stuff he does in Whitesnake is fabulous. I mean, on live, he's a massive X factor in the Whitesnake sound. On record, there are bits and pieces on Come and Get It and Ready and Willing and Slide It In, where there's just some brilliant Lord playing, or even on Whitesnake records. And his ability, in his own words, to kind of create a halo around the band and Mickey Moody and Bernie Marsden particularly, you know, his contribution to that band can't be underestimated because it's difficult. You know, a 6-person band of heavy rock where you're the keyboard player, it's not easy to find a space for yourself.
Right.
You've got to have a pretty good technical understanding to go, where can I fit here? Where can I complement Bernie? Where can I take a lead? Where can I step back? Where can I be a much more, you know, atmospheric contributor to the sound? And certainly the sad thing is, you know, after Perfect Strangers, you know, in Purple, I think from a morale and friendliness perspective, it falls apart pretty quickly. You know, Perfect Strangers, I feel partway through the tour, my personal opinion is, I think Richie Blackmore kind of goes, what am I doing here? Almost from his demeanor.
Yeah.
He starts tuning out a bit. And certainly by House of Blue Light and the following 2 albums, it's not a happy ship. You know, it's pulling teeth to get the music together. And the chemistry, you know, you see it on stage, it's there. And there's this amazing bit of footage of rehearsals around Come Hell or High Water, where Lord and the band are basically doing The Battle Rages On and Anya in a rehearsal space, I think in Czech. And whoever's filming it, might be Colin, might be Bruce Payne, gets really tight on Ian Pace and so on. And it's mind-blowing watching Ian Pace when the camera's in front of him and you see him 24 inches away versus hearing him on stage. If you hear him on stage, he's great.
Yeah.
If you see from the position of a camera, you watch what Ian's doing directly standing next to him, it's mind-blowing. It's not good. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Because you see that it's all in his wrist. It's all in his timing. It's all in the very, very sharp and snappy inflections in his playing. And you don't see any of that when the camera's straight on a drum. And it's a bit like Drumeo. When you watch Liberty DeVito and those guys and the camera's on them, you start realizing, my God, how amazing all these guys are, whether it's, you know, Nick Collins or Liberty DeVito or Tommy Aldridge. You can't appreciate what they're doing fully from an audience perspective or from either the front of the stage. You've got to be standing next to them, and then you see what Ian does, and it's incredible. It's incredible to watch, because you realize that it's all in the wrist, and in literally the ability to coordinate your wrist and your feet, and your left and right, is incredible.
Yeah, they're definitely on a different level.
A different level, yeah.
One thing I was really surprised by when we were talking sometime, maybe about a year ago, when we were trying to figure out what was going on with Rat Bat Blue, was that he really didn't get into synths until Burn, at least not in a huge degree, and that solo, while it sounds so alien and futuristic and new and fresh to what you've ever heard before, was really just achieved through those Hammond modifications. And he really didn't, because I was convinced for my entire life up until whatever, a year ago, that had to be some sort of synth he was using.
Well, it's interesting because I met or encountered Bill Axman, who did Don Airey's repair work on the Hammond in 2003, 2005. So when John Lord left Deep Purple in 2002, he gave the C3 Hammond to Don, which is the Hammond he'd had since 74. So he pretty much played only that, 74 to 2002, apart from the Rainbow Hammond that he played on Perfect Strangers, and on Come Hell or High Water on the tour, plus the odd replacement Hammond here and there, because it blew up somewhere in America, in the Midwest, and it needed to be replaced for a gig that night. And what you start realizing is, on Rat Bat Blue, Bill showed me the module, or I should say the control panel that was attached to the Hammond console, which allowed him to trigger the RMI voices on that through the Hammond. It's a very simple metal box, which is bought from a hardware shop or what have you, and on it are a whole load of switches, piano, harp, C, organ. And what he was able to do was play the RMI through that system of triggering the harpsichord effect or the organ effect or the piano effect through the RMI 300. And so my hypothesis, as we discussed when we spoke, was that since the Arp Odyssey, initially one of them doesn't get played until the US tour in 73. So if you take the timeline, Who Do We Think We Are is recorded partially in mid-72 and then in late 72. I recollect they start in June 72. They do Woman from Tokyo. They're too tired, sozzled, irritated in Rome to get it done. They land up with one track, and a track called Painted Horse. They then have to reconvene because they got record industry pressure to release an album. So in Frankfurt, using the mobile recording studio, in October 72, they get together to complete Who Do We Think We Are, and they managed to get it done. So that's a 1972 album in terms of its recording dates. And at that time, there's no ARP. I mean, there's no Mini Moog, he doesn't have any of that stuff. So the hypothesis could only be that he's using the Hammond, the RMI, which he gets in 1970, and the ring modulator for effects. It's not until 73 when you see them on stage at Hofstra University in New York in mid-73, those famous clips of space trucking and Smoke on the Water from that period where Gillan's got a beard and stuff. That's when you start seeing the Arp Odyssey behind John. And then the RMI gets integrated, and actually he's using a Fender Rhodes 73. So there's a little bit of a switch of keyboards. So you can conclude that you can hear the Arp on Burn, and you can hear RMI piano on Burn. You can apparently also, somebody had picked out on Sail Away a couple of other sounds, maybe even a Mellotron on Burn. but you don't hear any of that on Who Do We Think We Are? So to answer your point, and as per our conclusion, it's basically Hammond RMI and ring modulator that's creating all of that incredibly kinetic solo stuff on Rat Bat Blue, and on Smooth Dancer there's another really powerful solo, which is similarly basically almost like a sequencer sound because it's so program sounding, but it's basically using those effects. And then, as I said, Bill showed me the control panel, and it's just literally the Hammond console with a switch that was on the top left, and then the control panel on the right, and he was playing all of that through different controls. So, I mean, amazing, innovation and dexterity.
It's amazing that he was so far ahead of his time. He's like, he knew the sound he wanted. It didn't exist, so he created it. And it's almost like the synthesizers caught up to him. And then he said, "Oh, well, somebody's got the sound now. I'm going to take that. Now I'm going to innovate that and make that change." But it's incredible to see these guys so far ahead of the vast majority of their peers.
Absolutely. I mean, you're totally correct. I mean, it's almost as if he's going, "Look, I can't get the effects I want, even perhaps out of synths, and it's a whole learning exercise to integrate that. For now, let me just use what I've got." And so, when you listen to, the Lord solos on Made in Japan, which obviously with the new versions of that album, the remixes or remasters or what have you, remixes, I guess, the sound of what he's doing in Japan in August 72 is unbelievable. It's unbelievable listening to his solo on Space Trucking and listening to the sheer cut through of the Hammond sound, even on Highway Star. I mean, that solo that he plays on Highway Star and that Blackmore plays on Highway Star, the cut through of the Hammond is as sharp as the guitar sound. And you hear it on the record, but it sounds organy on the record. And then when you hear it live, it's like a very industrial machine sound because it's got an enormous amount of cut through, very, very sharp dynamics. And it's as, acoustically intrusive as a guitar sound. And he's one of the few players who can do that. And Keith did it, but Keith did it with an acoustic guitar player who was mainly playing electric guitar. And obviously in Yes, Rick and Steve Howe are obviously complementing each other to a heavy degree, but no one is able to take on a guitar the way John does. And if you want to hear a live example of that, I would say Made in Japan is the definitive example of, somebody going, "I'm going to take this thing and I'm going to make it sound as loud, aggressive, hairy, and industrial as a guitar."
Yeah, it's incredible. And I love this part of your book contains this visual timeline of the pieces of equipment. Very similar to if you're familiar with any band website on Wikipedia, you go to the band member timeline and you can see year by year who's in what. You've got this great collection of all of the pieces of equipment he used and what time frames he used them in and what he was using together. You've even broken it down into like phases. Like this is one phase of the early 60s. This is another phase of the early 70s. But brilliant way of visualizing. I love those sorts of visual elements to really bring home and be able to put it together in your head because there's so much different stuff on this list.
It was a memory test in a way because, a couple of people were enormously helpful. Con, who I described, Con more on the Hammond side. And then Nick Foley kicks in, and Nick was is obviously a huge admirer of John Lord, and obviously he's got his own channel as well. And Nick was really quite insightful on some of the effects because what you start seeing in the White Snake phase, if you look at the old Grey Whistle Test White Snake appearance in October 78, suddenly John's like at Tony Banks level or Keith Emerson level. It's like, Polymoog, Micromoog, effects unit box, Hohner clavinet D6, which he does play in purple at the end. But and then the Minimoog, which interestingly, he only starts playing really in the Whitesnake and in the Purple era, in the Perfect Strangers era. He doesn't play a mini Moog in Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, Mark 4 at all. And then you start seeing him, and that's the era people like we will recollect on stage. You know, when you see him at Hammersmith Odeon, you know, the keyboard's as high as him. You know, he's got this enormous rack in front of him. He's got this enormous rack behind him. And it becomes, you know, very interesting because suddenly he taps into a whole load of different sounds, and gets into the polyphonic era with the Polymoog and dumps a lot of the ARP stuff, keeps the ARP string ensemble, which he becomes quite a fan of for a long time. But in front of him, you've got the Hammond, the string ensemble, the Hohner clarinet D6, the ring modulator still, and then even the Roland RE201 Space Echo. You know, he starts using that, which is quite a famous piece of kit of that period, is now a classic piece of effects kit. And then on the left-hand side, you know, he's got the Polymoog and the Yamaha CP70 and the Yamaha CP80, because suddenly you've got a load of piano sound in Whitesnake, which he never used in Purple. So, you know, he starts to become a slightly different player, because he uses synths actually a lot more. Still relies on the Hammond as the mainstay, but there's a lot in there. And the other thing you start seeing is these custom effects boxes, your kind of OLX mixer. There's basically either effects or submixers where, and you see Don Airey doing it now on stage, where Don has the Hammond and the Kurzweil and the Moog Voyager, but behind his speakers, he's basically got a mixing desk, which keyboard tech is sitting behind. And what they're doing is they're doing a submix before it goes into front of house. So if Don wants to overlay a sound or an effect, that's done almost locally on his own unit, and you'll see a whole rack of different things he has, 5 or 6 of them. And then that sound, which Don's happy with and goes, all right, that's my sound, that then goes front of house, you know, into the main mixing desk, etc., and then goes to the audience. So John was doing a version of that in the Whitesnake period because, you know, he probably needed to be more sensitive to the mixing of the sound with 2 guitarists on stage. And then if you ever saw him around 84, 85, certainly, I'm sorry, 84, because he leaves Whitesnake in April of 84, you know, he's competing with John Sykes, and that becomes really difficult, and Cozy Powell. So the big difference, you know, I saw them in 83 on the Saints and Sinners tour, and then I saw them in 84 on the Slide It In tour. And it's a completely different level of volume. And Cozy's in the band, even Slide It In. He's not on the album, but he's on the tour. But on stage, you know, with John Sykes and Cozy and Mel Galley, you know, it's loud. It's really, really loud. And so he has to do a lot more to cut through. And I think the mixers contribute to that and the effects contribute to that. So he starts getting into, a lot more. And that's a different phase. So, you know, to answer your point about phasing, you know, you get the Mellotron phase, and then you get the Hammond RMI phase, and then you get the kind of analog synth phase of the ARP, and the Hohner clarinet, which is not really a synthesizer. It's more of a kind of almost like an electro piano. And then you get the polyphonic stage with the Polymoog and the Micro Moog and the Moog Opus 3 that he uses. And then you get the sampling stage with the emulator and emulator 2, which he plays on Perfect Strangers and House of Blue Light. If you listen to tracks like Strange Ways on House of Blue Light, you can hear there's a lot of Yamaha DX7, DX1, and emulator 2 on there. And then he gets into MIDI with the Yamaha DX7. And then he gets into the workstation era, if you can call it that, with the Korg M1. And then he gets into the module stage with a lot of his keyboard stuff off stage. So you see all these different stages.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's really interesting. This book is, I can't wait to get my hands on a physical copy. It's going to be great. You've got obviously some great words said about it by Paul Mann, by Colin Hart, who were instrumental in getting you filling in the gaps and getting some great information for you to put this together. So We're recording this in advance, so I don't know. We're going to kind of time its release for when the book is officially going to be able to be pre-ordered or whatever. Tell me about the two different versions of the book, how people are going to get the book, like all that sort of stuff.
What we're doing is, in the course of doing it, I got to know Paul Mann really quite well, and I met him, in fact, in London last week. So what we're going to do is, I did the book, and I figured, having a publishing history with the limited edition books with Ali and Pele and people like that, I figured I'd publish it myself with my own imprint rather than relying on, going to a publisher and perhaps even having to change it, to be honest. Because when someone publishes it, it is their prerogative to say, well, can you change this or give that more emphasis, or there's not enough personal life, or whatever it is, have a bit more black, more fighting. Where's the spaghetti plate? All that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. We need some juicy content here.
You've got to have an angle, So I didn't want an angle. And I figured the only way to protect that from an angle, because the angle I wanted to focus on, was the angle of the research, as opposed to the angle of infighting. So I figured publish it, and obviously the economics then become a little bit more advantageous with a relatively small print run. And then alongside that, what we're going to do is do a pre-order version signed by Paul Mann and myself, which we're going to launch on Before We Forget .store, STORE. So we've built a website for that. And we're going to have a limited number of units available, signed by myself and signed by Paul on that, which is really for our real friends in the Purple fraternity. Your audience, Nick Foley's audience, highwaystar.com, people like that. You'll really have the hardcore fans with them. So do about 250 units that way. And then the rest of it will be trade initially in the UK. So it'll be available in Waterstones and Daunt and, W.H. Smith and those, which has now been renamed, but the traditional booksellers in about end of March, April of 2026. But the pre-order version, signed by myself and Paul, in a unit of 250 is going to be available to pre-order in December of 2025, with a shipment date of most likely end of January, latest first week of February of 2026. So two versions. The one we want to push is our version to capture the economics, to fund our print run, to get it really rolling properly. And then obviously we'll fund the traditional print run, which we're doing. And that's going to be through the book trade, primarily in the UK. And then we'll take a look, because the distributor we're working with has got really good European coverage. That one of the leading names in the UK, Compass, CBS. So what we'll do is do it in the UK through the book trade, but drive pre-orders as our kind of inaugural version for Deep Purple fans. I was lucky enough on November 20, through the kind effort and goodness of Mike Airy, to meet Roger and Don Airy in Dubai when they played the Coca-Cola Arena in Dubai on November 20. So I was lucky enough to meet them, and they took a very keen interest in it. And Mike said to me in advance, of course they're going to be interested in a book about John. You don't need to worry about that. And Roger obviously couldn't have been nicer, and Don was very nice and enthusiastic about the work. So I met them, and then met Paul, who I'd been on and off collaborating with on it for a few months. Met him in London last week. So, that's what really matters. And Steve Lord was, gave me, I have to say, the nicest encouragement, as only he can. And these are the things that mean something, Nate. When people like yourself and Steve and Paul, and
I wouldn't put me in the category with those guys, but thank you.
Well, it's a different value you bring to it, because you bring your own value to it, and then you realize, I'd be perfectly happy with a handful of people I respect liking it. It's not a book that's designed to be serialized in the Daily Mail. No disrespect, though I'd love those economics. It's a book.
Economically, it would be great, but
Absolutely.
it might be a little soul sucking.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a book designed for John Lord fanatics, for Deep Purple fanatics, for people interested. I think the widest audience is people interested in classic rock and people interested in the history of the synthesizer through the lens of a particular player.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I've done is done it for John Lord because that's my passion. But you could do a book about Tony Banks and his history with synths, or Keith Emerson,
mm-hmm.
Or Rick Wakeman quite readily. And if other people do that, I'd be the happiest guy in the world. If someone did a Tony Banks book about Tony's, work on keyboards, and Keith Emerson is a fabulous subject. But it's unlikely to be me because, my passion is John Lord. But I do believe that, that's a really interesting area. And as you know, from our past conversations, if you take old memory Moogs, Poly Moogs, original Mini Moogs, Model Ds, I mean, these are things which are now starting to fetch, $10, $15, $20,000. I mean, if you want to buy, an original Emulator One, or an original memory Moog, you're talking real money. So there is an industry, aside from the John Lord and the Hammond and all the rest of it, and the effects modules and all that. There's an industry of analog synthesizer collection, and polyphonic synthesizer collection, and a few players still play them. You see a few people who still have them on stage. Increasingly, as per the Mike McDonald example, most guys have gone too unstable. I'd love to have my Fender Rhodes piano, but I'll never get the full reliability on a tour around the world, and the delicacy with which you have to handle it. And so, but there is a lot of studio work, guys like Anthony Marinelli, on YouTube. If you check his channel out, I mean, he'll have great filling gains playing, the synclavier part from Thriller. It's fascinating to watch.
Yeah.
He's got a huge array of all this stuff, which is fascinating because these things look amazing. I mean, one of the things you notice, even with John, is by the 90s, between the Korg M1 and the Roland piano and the Yamaha DX7, it's all just black stuff. Even the Hammond gets painted black.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a wall of, a relatively low wall of very similar looking stuff where you really have to look closely to work out what is that, because they all look the same by then. All keyboards by the 90s, often the mainstream ones, kind of look really similar. And there's something about the analog pieces from the 70s and 80s and the polyphonic, when you look at a PPG wave, which Keith Emerson used and people like that, they just look amazing. I mean, if one had all the money in the world, you'd have half a house full of this stuff just to look at it. And even the Yamaha DX1 that John uses in 86, 87 is a Brazilian rosewood edition of only 140 were ever manufactured.
Wow.
And you'll get people like Elton John and Guy Fletcher from Dire Straits who used it quite extensively, and there are very few of them left. So the sad thing is, where are the John Lord keyboards? The answer is most of them have disappeared.
Yeah, and we've talked before. I think I think when they were using things just kind of fell by the wayside, or that broke and got thrown away or repurposed or whatever, and there wasn't anyone following up after them saying no, we must preserve that or keep that. So there's no there could be this great imaginary Deep Purple museum somewhere, but I think most of them, they're busy with their tour. Obviously it's not going to be the guys in the band, they're too busy, and so are the crew. So there was no one really to save a lot of that stuff, because for them it was just like, it's like for you or me, your shoes wear out, you get a new pair of shoes and keep walking. You don't think about it, but they're just creating magic with these items. And in many ways not having a ton of sentimentality about the actual piece of equipment.
It's interesting. It's a common thread with the Purple guys, I feel, because when you look at the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or David Bowie,
mm-hmm.
I mean, forget keeping it, is literally archived.
Yes.
I mean, Bowie's wardrobe before it went to the V&A, Victorian Albert Museum in London. Clearly, it was in a storage facility. Clearly, a fashion curator was looking after it. Clearly, everything was heavily protected in terms of it not disintegrating because of weather conditions and temperature. And clearly, everything was labeled.
Yeah.
And if you look at John Lennon's stuff, from what I understand, at the Dakota apartment, I mean, they don't have one apartment. I believe they've got 3 or 4. And it's probably now been moved out. But Yoko Ono kept everything of John. I mean, his Beatles outfits, suits, his Rickenbacker guitars, his recording equipment, everything was preserved because she knew from the diaries to the keyboards to the clothing to the notes, she kept everything. And even Metallica, famously have a storage facility where all of Kirk's and James's guitars are stored, apparently 400 or 500 guitars in one single facility. And so these guys, they somehow they understand, and sadly, in the Purple context, even Richie Blackmore, there's a YouTube clip of him at home with a few of his guitars around him, and it's nothing. It's none of his stuff. I mean,
it's just a few things. Right? Yeah,
it's a few Martin acoustics, probably a couple of white Fender Strats or off-white Strats, but his Gibson 335 pre-Fender Strat, it's all gone. And John's stuff, I mean, he gave the Hammond to Don. He didn't say, "Oh, my Hammond, which I played on, Burn era, Stormbringer, come taste the Hammond in the recording sessions if it's not one of the rented Hammonds." And certainly all across the live career, but he just gave it to Don. It was of no value to him to go, "This is an heirloom for my kids. I can store this and restore it. It can go to the NAMM Museum or to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame." He couldn't give a monkey. He just went, "It's a great piece, and Don's the owner of it now because Don has a right to have it more than me." Incredible. And all the synth stuff vis-a-vis the RMI, I mean, it's all gone. The ring modulators, God knows where those are. The Memory Moog, we saw, Nate, you and I. The John Lord Memory Moog came up on eBay, which we tried to capture. So, you
give me a little too much credit for that one too.
you were my motivator.
Yeah.
So it's a shame because when you look at even Keith Emerson's Moog modular system or his Goff customized Hammond, I think C3. Sorry, not C3. I think it's an A100. It's all sitting in museums in the US, and the Tonto system that Robert Margoulev and Malcolm Cecil had is now in Calgary in the museum in Canada. But John's stuff is nowhere to be seen. I don't think it's anywhere. I mean, one of the great shows I saw was the touring Pink Floyd show, which they did in around 2017, 2018. I saw it in Dortmund and in London at the V&A. And it was amazing. I mean, a lot of the guitars were replicas of Gilmour's and Rogers' Fender bass. Mm-hmm. There wasn't as much original stuff of theirs as I would have hoped, but Rick Wright's keyboards were there. Mellotron, I think, and it would be amazing for there to be a show of just the Deep Purple stuff. Notes, manuscripts, lyric sheets. Richie's guitars, his Gibson, his Fender, John's Hammond. Sadly, it's probably not going to happen because there doesn't seem to be a kind of an institutional focus on it in terms of Purple. No disrespect to them at all. Far be it for me to take a pop in any way, but they're busy touring. They're a touring band. They're a touring band, and then they're an albums recording band, and they're a songwriting band. They're not a museum band. They're not. I don't think they're interested in, hey, let's have a touring, museum of all of our stuff. I don't think they're not those kind of guys, I guess.
No. Yeah, it's a shame. I think it comes from kind of their overall personalities, right? They probably think, well, who the heck would want to see that? Who cares what, to us as fans, it would be fascinating to just, even behind glass, to just be able to look at, Rogers' bass from early 70s or something. But to them, they're just, like who wants to see that? It's just old stuff. We don't use it anymore.
I mean, Ian Pace tells the story of his his Made in Japan kit, which was in his house, and there was some local kid who didn't have a drum kit, who he was, I guess, tutoring for half an hour. Whenever somebody said, "Can you teach this kid a few rudiments or whatever?" Ian, on an off day, went, "Okay, let me just spend an hour with this kid. Have you got a kit? No, I don't have a kit. All right, why don't you take one of mine?" He gives the guy the Made in Japan kit by mistake without quite realizing. And even if he had realized, he'd probably have done it anyway. Not because he's absent-minded, because he's not, in that regard, a collector of this stuff in that way. And, the kit never to be seen again. I mean, imagine the Made in Japan drum kit. And similarly, bits and pieces of, John's Mellotron is with a collector. Richie's Gibson 335 is with a collector. They'd have given stuff away. I think John's keyboards will often have been given away.
Yeah.
Nothing. I mean, when he moved to the Roland piano and stopped using the Yamaha CP70, CP80, I can guarantee you they weren't even sold. I bet they were just given away. And those are amazing pieces that have been on some great records. The Arp Odyssey, he had 2 of those. I'm sure they got chucked when the Polymo came, et cetera, et cetera. So it comes from, almost like a heavy practicality mindset, plus a very down-to-earth mentality of who the hell would be interested in my ring modulator. Just, it doesn't work now.
I would have taken one of old John Lord's old shoes.
Absolutely. Well,
I'd have it framed behind me.
Yeah, I'm after that denim shirt from California Jam. If anyone's got it.
Absolutely.
Always like that shirt. But, it's like, they just didn't have that type of mindset of archival type of approach. And then you look at the repercussions, and 50 years later you can go to the Victorian Albert Museum and see every single David Bowie outfit from every single tour.
Yep.
And ditto the Beatles and the Stones. From what I understand, they've got everything. All of Bill Wyman's kits, all of Ringo's kits, to a large extent. Stuff comes up on auction, but there'll be a pretty decent chunk of stuff. And John's stuff, you notice, doesn't come up on auction much.
No.
Obviously, McCartney, got recovered his bass guitar.
Oh yeah, like within the last few years, right?
Literally last year.
Yeah.
In his Hofner bass, which had been replaced with another Hoffman bass for about 54 years. Crazy. The original Hofner was stolen from the Wings van, I think in Ladbroke Grove, outside a church where they were rehearsing and recording. Not recording, but rehearsing. Someone worked out, McCartney's here, someone worked out there must be some stuff in the van. They wouldn't have realized the value in 1971 of McCartney's Hofner bass. They'd have thought, that's quite usle. I'll get a tenner for that if I sell it stuff. They wouldn't have thought. In 2025, people are going to be paying, $9 million, $10 million for stuff like that. So you can imagine when Gilmour sells his guitars and Jeff Beck's stuff went on auction early this year for several a multi-million-dollar lot in totality, and Gilmour's guitars are talking, 2, 3, 4 million each. I mean, you can imagine the value of McCartney's Hofner bass, which gets recovered in an attic where clearly a dying grandfather goes to his grandson. Lad, I've got something horrible to tell you. That's Paul McCartney's bass guitar. I'll be gone, but give it back to him. And, I'm sure he won't mind too much. And he's not going to go after us in court or whatever, which McCartney's never going to do, because he's going to be more than happy to get his guitar. He's not going to be interested in the legal repercussions. So the grandson recovers the guitar and it gets given to McCartney, I think, last year.
It was recently, yeah.
It was recently. But, you see McCartney leaving a hotel in Brazil with the guitar in his hand. I mean, he doesn't let go of it.
Right.
He's literally got the bass guitar, because it's quite small, in a case with him all the time. But that guitar, which I'm sure the kids will never need to sell, put it that way. But if it were to go on the market, God forbid, post McCartney, that's a $20 million guitar.
Yeah,
for sure.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, as always, my friend, it has been wonderful talking to you. I look forward so much to this book release. Encourage everybody listening to buy multiple copies. Give them to. Too bad this probably won't come out. Or the book won't come out before Christmas. Buy for next Christmas.
Absolutely.
And, give them to everybody you know. But it's been a pleasure all these years chatting with you about this and seeing this come from a little idea of an ebook to an actual huge production here, and more than just a focus on the equipment. But I think you covered it really well about what makes this book so special in the beginning, which is that there's information in this book that has never been seen before, that hasn't been out before. There's a lot of these books that come out, and they're good books, they're well researched, and they've got quotes. But if you're a fan of a particular album or person, you pick this book up, you're going to be happy with the information that's in it. But it's probably all quotes that can be acquired elsewhere. If you buy Before We Forget, you're getting a collection of information which is largely unreleased or unknown up until this point, and certainly not compiled and put together in a way that could be used for reference. So this book is your blueprint, along with, if you have $10,000-$20,000 to buy all this equipment, you could put together one of Jon Lord's rigs from the many eras. But this is going to be such a great book, so great for collectors and for fans of Jon Lord, Deep Purple, and just equipment like this 70s rock music in general. So thank you so much for your work putting this together, and thanks for coming on the show to talk about it.
Real pleasure always connecting with you, Nate. And as I said, we're going to put it out on beforeweforget.store shortly, actually, and start moving with the pre-order side. But it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I think it goes without saying that your dedication, is incredible, because everybody I talk to in the Purple fraternity knows you. And the reason for that, which is you're sincere to what you do, is not about opportunism or about money. Actually, it's about a passion for the subject and getting it to as many people as possible. And everybody knows that you do it for exactly the right reason.
Oh, that you're too kind. But yeah, as we said, I think the other day when we were talking, if you and I were in this for the money, we'd be doing a true crime podcast and book companion. But we're doing this for the love of the subject.
I'd be doing an Aussie biography.
Exactly. All his equipment. It'd be a much shorter book.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, my friend, and we'll talk again soon.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
If you like the Deep Purple podcast and would like to support the show, please consider joining our Patreon or donating on PayPal. Patrons get full access to the podcast, Discord server, ratings, spreadsheets, and live stream invites. You can also leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help new people discover the show. You can follow the show on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, or Threads. You can also check out the website at deeppurplepodcast.com for show notes and more. Contact us via email at John or Nate at deeppurplepodcast.com. Thanks for listening.